Hello, and welcome to our final lecture for this week, the lecture on Knowledge, a Very Short Introduction, Chapter 5. Now, Chapter 5 is on a very important question in epistemology, the debate between internalism and externalism. The way it's presented in the book is primarily as an issue of knowledge, and this is true, but with a little bit of a twist that I'm not sure the book gets across. The real debate between the internalist and externalist is about justification, the kinds of relationships we need to have to evidence in order to be justified. Now, this is, of course, related to knowledge because knowledge is typically assumed to require justification of some sort. So really what we're going to be talking about when we talk about the internalist and externalist debate are two different ways of understanding the relationship that a knower has to have to their justification for believing in something for that to count as knowledge, for them to actually be justified in knowing it. In fact, we might say that this is almost more important than most of the discussions that are purely about knowledge. Because while knowledge might be a narrow area, right, we might allow that, okay, there's only a few things you really know. We need justification to be a good deal broader. To be justified in epistemology has roughly the same significance as being justified in ethics. It means you're allowed to do that, right? You're allowed to believe this thing. Well, if we're not allowed to believe much, we're in trouble, right? We're going to fall into essentially the worst version of the skeptic. Even if you're a knowledge skeptic, though, you can still have justified beliefs, right? So you can still function off of justification. So we really need to have this idea of justification to be clear to us to avoid us from falling into essentially justification skepticism where we're totally just out of luck, right? So our two primary ideas here are internalism and externalism. The internalist with respect to justification believes that we must be aware of evidence. We must have internal evidence, internal awareness of the systems that justify us to count as being justified. The externalist says that actually we can rely on systems we don't have any intimate awareness of, systems that are beyond us or outside of us or we don't have access to, right? We don't get to see what we know or see the justification or all of the evidence, but we can still count as knowing. So let's take a look at what justification means, right? To really hammer in how important this concept is, how concept this important is. Justification is how we ought to believe, right? You ought to believe in justified beliefs. Now, this is different than allowable beliefs, right? There are allowable errors. You can be understandably mistaken. The same way you can understand that someone did something wrong in ethics. Being justified does not mean you are right? You can be justified and wrong. Justification is fallible, is the way you'd say this, right? So I might be justified in believing that there's not a camel outside, but who knows? Right? If there is a camel outside, I'd be wrong. Even though it would be totally justified in me assuming that there isn't one. Justification, again, is a normative concept similar to justification in ethics, and is arguably more important than knowledge because of its breadth, as opposed to knowledge's relative narrowness. Right? Justified belief is what is supposed to help us get around every day, even when knowledge isn't there to help. So let's talk about internalism. Internalists say that we need to be aware of the justifications that we have to be justified. That is, you have to have conscious awareness of what justifies your belief to count as being justified. This is a pretty intuitive or natural view. It feels like you should need to know that you have a good reason to count as having a good reason. Right? You need to know what qualifies you to say that you know. You need to know what evidence you have. Now, one big problem for the internalist is a vulnerability to regress. Regress means that it just sort of keeps going back. In this case, it's infinite regress, so it'll go back forever. Do we need to know the evidence that justifies the evidence that justifies the evidence that justifies the da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, right? Do we need to have access to the 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 access, right? And if you allow that, it goes back forever. There are a couple of ways we can try to resolve this. One is through what's called foundationalism, where you just build a rock-solid ground and say this is where all knowledge or justification begins. Take René Descartes' cogito. That is a foundation. Alternatively, we can take like a contextualism, or we might call contextual foundationalism, which is there are assumptions to every field of study that we are justified in just assuming when we enter it. When you do mathematics, you get to assume 2 + 2 = 4. Not generally speaking, but just in context of that field. When you enter physics, you get to assume that the world is roughly how we observe it. Not generally speaking, right? And when you do math, you can't assume that, because that's not one of the axioms of mathematics, but it is an axiom of physics. Now, of course, the immediate question is which foundations and axioms, and how is this not just you saying, oh yeah, no, this is totally a basic belief, we get to believe this without any justification. These unjustified beliefs are called properly basic beliefs. You might remember this from our discussion of skepticism. Or, well, they're called basic beliefs. Whether or not they're properly basic beliefs depends on whether or not you're actually justified in saying they need no justification. Right, so again, you can get a variant of the regress as, okay, well, you've said you don't need justification for the truth of that claim. What's your justification for the truth of the claim that you don't need justification for the truth of that claim? Right, and then you start the regress again. So the big problem for internalism is that while it's intuitive, it produces this awkward regress where we have to be aware of everything. It also isn't super accurate in depicting how we think, right? You're not necessarily aware of the processes that go into making your eyes reliable information sources, are you? Maybe you are. Maybe you're an optometrist or a neuroscientist and you have at least some part of the picture. I'm not. Does that mean all visual reports I have are unjustified? That seems really weird. To say that I'm not justified in believing there's a camera there, even though I see it, even though I use it, right? Because I don't necessarily know how it works, right? Or a clear and distinct idea of a camera, or know that my eyes accurately report, or more importantly, I don't know how they report. These challenges lead us to externalism, justification without awareness of evidence. We can rely on external properties of the world, causal stories of knowledge, causal theories of knowledge, reliabilist theories of knowledge, and another variant called tracking theory, which is essentially reliabilism plus a little bit. Causal and reliable theories are covered in Chapter 3 of KVSI and our last lecture, tracking theory, in Chapter 4, and you'll see that it's very similar to reliabilism. These are all externalist views, because what gives us justification, if anything, is things like the reliability of these systems of interacting with the world. We don't need to be aware of their reliability, right? We don't need to be aware of what makes them reliable, rather, right? We don't need to be aware of what makes our eyes reliable. We do need to be aware, presumably, that it is a reliable system of thinking. I need to know that my eyes work. But I don't need to know how or why. I just need to know that. Now, one thing that's a common problem amongst externalism is what's called the generality problem. So we have these terms like appropriately caused, reliable, and tracking. And I've mentioned with last chapter's lecture, these terms generate problems. And the generality problem is one of the worst of those. So, remember the fake barn county example, right? We're talking about you're going down the road, you see a barn on the side of the road, you say, hey, this is a barn, it's very nice. There's a bunch of other barns around, but this one's particularly nice. Well, little did you know that this is fake barn county. So you can't trust the reliability of your experience here. But little did you know that one actually is a barn. So, right, the reliabilist answer here, the move here, is to deflate what's a Gettier-style problem, right, where you're saying, well, this theory of knowledge, this causal theory of knowledge, says that I should know that this is a barn, even though I'm really just lucky. So they say, well, it's not reliable here. But, actually, it depends on how you construe here. If you mean reliable with respect to this individual barn, every time I see it, I'm going to say there's a barn. That's very reliable. So, actually, in that case, I do know. If you mean reliable in context of fake barn county, then you're right, I don't know. Because fake barn county, seeing a barn doesn't mean there is a barn there. Now, if you mean reliable in the world as a whole, almost every time I see a barn means there's a barn there. Fake barn county's tiny. They only have a few barns. There are lots of barns out there. So suddenly, again, I have knowledge. The problem here is that our answer about what counts, right, whether or not this is knowledge, will change from context to context. And it's not clear how we define this boundary. So there are three responses to the generality problem that the externalist might take. The first is relativism, to say, well, there really just isn't a fact of the matter about which boundary we should use. You might know in one context, not in another, and that's just how it has to be, right? This is reliable with respect to this barn, not to fake barn county, yes to barns in America, yes to barns in the planet, yes to barns in the universe, probably. That is fine if you're okay with being a relativist with respect to knowledge. But remember, back to our very first chapter, there's something kind of weird about that, saying everybody knows what they think, right? All of your beliefs count as knowledge or something to that effect, right? Everything would count as knowledge at some level or another, probably. And that seems a little disconcerting because one of the values of epistemology is supposed to tell us how to believe. Well, if you can't tell me what level I'm supposed to assess my beliefs at, then you can't tell me how to believe either, because you can't tell me whether or not I'm doing it right. Our next view might just be, well, no, there are natural boundaries, right? No, you don't worry about it. Fake Barn County really is the way you need to be analyzing this supposed case of knowledge, and then ta-da, you don't know. Exactly what we wanted, right? Oh, as we always said. This is a nice view, except for the fact that it gives us no reason to believe it's true. Now, there are presumably arguments for this, and people turn to things like natural language, the way we speak, and that sort of thing to try to draw boundaries. But it isn't clear what those are, and that's going to be quite a project to define those boundaries, if any exist whatsoever. The final response is actually a bit of a fallacy. It's called tu quoque, which means you too. Essentially, internalists have this problem too, because internalists also believe about systems of evidence, presumably, right? And yet, they haven't given any defense. So this is just going to be a problem for them too. Another challenge for the externalist is Samantha, I call it Samantha the super specific psychic. This is the case of the woman who has psychic awareness of the president. Think back to that case from the book, right? So she believes in this untested psychic capacity, but she is right? She always knows where the president is, even though she's never bothered to check. Two responses: strange but true, crazy how nature do that. Look at that, this woman actually has knowledge of where the president is at all times. The next other way to go around is say, well, actually she doesn't have knowledge, there's something wrong with her reasoning, she's ignoring countervailing evidence. Then, of course, the internalists can say, well, why does evidence matter all of a sudden when it didn't matter to you 5 minutes ago? Alternatively, you might... what I would say is that the thing that's wrong with her reasoning is that her psychic capacity is untested. Not that she doesn't, she's not aware of the evidence, so she's not aware of how the evidence works, right? But she hasn't tested her psychic capacity to see that it works in the same way that we've tested our eyes by, like, touching things, right? If I continuously saw things I couldn't touch, that might make me think my eyes don't work. That's a side note, though, for now. So there might be a chance for a middle ground between externalist and internalist. So one thing, right, as we mentioned last time, externalists might need for a lack of counter evidence or something like that, and again, the internalist is going to say, well, why does that matter now? Potentially a more promising way to think about it is the difference between automatic and analytical thought. So this is something from the book, right? Automatic thought, very quick, very fast, very externalist. You don't really have awareness to the things that justify you about your belief that, a brick is flying at your face as you dodge, right? You don't, I wonder if the thud, right? That would not go well for you. Analytical thought, on the other hand, is when you sit down and start stroking your chin and go, I wonder. And in that case, you do seem to have a need for justification. This might actually sound similar to stuff that Moore said, right? Remember, he talked about there are contexts where you really want to be philosophical and very deep, and there are contexts where you just need to get by, and you shouldn't be asking, do I really have hands? Because that's a weird thing to ask. Whether or not either of these middle ground systems are going to work is not clear. Because it doesn't seem that just saying, oh, well, there's a middle ground actually solves anything until you develop fully what that middle ground looks like. When exactly do you need justification? What is how automatic does the thought have to be before you need to have access to a justification? Right? You need to have conscious awareness of the evidence you're citing. In other words, we can think of another version of the generality problem applied here. So the things to think about moving forward with respect to the internalist-externalist debate is, what way do we need to be related to the evidence we have to count as being justified? What way do we need to be related to the justifications, the things that give us the right to believe certain things? How closely do we need to be tied to these to actually be justified in believing them? So this is the thing to think about as you move forward, right? How closely tied do I have to be to my justifications to be knowing properly, to be thinking properly? That's it for today, and our final topic for the week. I will see you with our lectures for the next set of classes, or the next set of chapters. I hope that the lectures were all accessible, and I'll see you next time.